means of interrogation if the parties are independent of each other, right? So it is to ensure the effectiveness of the investigation of the process being audited. An audit, by definition, is only effective as a means of interrogation if the parties are independent of each other. Now, the 3 threats to independence. There are 3 threats to independence described in that particular case. 1. Remember what they had said, that the audit partner said he has been a client there for 8 years. Also, another point that he had mentioned, that they provide additional consultancy services. And another one that he had mentioned, which is very glaring, that he said that they are old friends from university days. Right? So these are 3 main ones. So the first, the same audit partner, which is Zachary, was assigned to Van Buren in 8 consecutive years. This is an association threat. So what this is known as an association threat. So the first threat that has been identified is the threat of association. Right? So this association threat, let's explain. He has been assigned there for 8 consecutive years. It is an association threat and it's a contravention of some corporate governance code. Both SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, and the Smith guidance contained in the UK Combined Code, for example, specify auditor rotation to avoid association threat. So that's our first threat. The second threat is providing additional services. Fillmore Pierce provides more than one service to the same client. One of the threats to independence identified between Arthur Andersen and Enron after the Enron collapse was an overdependence on Enron by Arthur Andersen arising from the provision of several services to the same client. Good practice is not to offer additional services to audit clients to avoid appearance of compromised independence. Some corporate governance codes formally prohibit this. Right, so the second one is providing other services. Then our third threat to independence that we have identified is the familiarity threat. Right, so there's a familiarity threat. What is this? The audit partner, Zachary himself, is an old friend of the financial director, who is Frank. This familiarity threat should be declared to Fillmore Pierce at the outset, and it may disqualify Zachary from acting as audit partner on the Van Buren account. Now part B. Let's look. What was the requirement for B? Describe our contrasting roles as an employee and as a professional accountant, compare and contrast, and then explain the ethical tension between these roles that Anne is now experiencing. Joint professional and organizational rules are common to most professionals, medical professionals for example. Although the rules are rarely in conflict, in most cases it is assumed that any professional's primary duty is to the public interest rather than the organization. So generally that is the assumption. In most cases it is assumed that any professional's primary duty is to the public interest rather than to a particular organization. Now let's compare and contrast her role as an employee, her organizational role, and her role as a professional accountant, her professional role. Her organizational role. As a member of staff of Fillmore PLC, Anne is part of the hierarchy of an organization and answerable to her seniors. This means that under normal circumstances, she should comply with requirements of her seniors. As an employee, Anne is ultimately accountable to the principals of the organization, the partners in an audit firm, or the shareholders in a company. So this is who she's really accountable to, the principals. And she is subject to the cultural norms and reasonable expectations of work group membership. It is expected that at work, her behavior will conform to the social and cultural norms of the organization, and that she will be efficient and hardworking in her job. Right? So her organizational role, she's a member of staff. She is accountable to the principals of the organization, whether the partners or the shareholders, and she is subject to the cultural norms and reasonable expectation of work group membership. Right? So she is expected that she should behave in conformity with the social and cultural norms of the organization, and that she will be efficient and hardworking in her actual position. Now, her professional role. As an accountant, Anne is obliged to maintain the high professional and ethical standards of her profession. If her profession is underpinned by an ethical or professional code, she will need to comply with that in full. She needs to manage herself and coordinate her activities so as to meet professional standards. In this, she needs to ensure that she informs herself in current developments in her field and undertakes CPD, continuing professional development, as required by her professional accounting body. She is and will remain accountable to her professional body in terms of continued registration and professional behavior. In many cases, this accountability will be more important than the accountability to a given employer, as it is the membership of the professional body that validates Anne's professional skills. Right? So that's her professional role. So she's obliged to maintain high professional and ethical standards of her profession. And in summary, at the end, as we said, in many cases, her accountability as a professional is much more important than that given to an employer, as membership to that professional body is really validated, and that is what really validates her actual professional skill, her actually being in employment in the first place. Now, what are the tensions in seeking to bridge the gap between these two roles? Now, on one hand, Anne needs to cultivate and manage her relationship with her manager, who seems convinced that Van Buren and Frank in particular are incapable of bad practice. Right? So on one hand, she needs to cultivate and manage her relationship with Zachary, and although he seems to be convinced that Frank in particular and the company of Van Buren are incapable of bad practice, it's virtually impossible, he shows evidence of poor judgment and compromised independence. Anne must decide how to deal with Zachary's poor judgment. On the other hand, Anne has a duty to both the public interests and the shareholders of Van Buren to ensure that the accounts do contain a true and fair view. Under a materiality test, she may ultimately decide that the payment in question need not hold up the audit sign-off, but the poor client explanation is also a matter of concern to Anne as a professional accountant. Right? So on one hand, she needs to manage her relationship with her boss, Zachary, and to make a decision on how to deal with his poor judgment. On the other hand, she has a duty to the public interest and shareholders, and to ensure that the accounts really contain a true and fair view. So she may further do a materiality test to decide whether or not these payments may hold up or may not hold up the sign-off of the audit, and also to take into consideration the poor explanation given by the client, Frank in particular, and as her concern as a professional accountant. Right, so we dealt with auditor independence. Why is it important? What are the three threats to independence in this particular scenario? What are the contrasting roles between her as an employee and her as a professional accountant? What are the tensions in fulfilling both roles? And then part C, a dogmatic and a pragmatic approach. What are these? What are the definitions? How would these be applied